Thank you, Gretel. Let's just see if I got all my controls here. Right, so good day and welcome to everyone joining us from my side as well. We at the Answer series, fondly referred to as TAS, are very excited to offer you our first Natural Sciences webinar, as Gretel mentioned. As per usual, I'm Marichen Vermeulen, and together with Liesel Sterrenberg and Grace Elliott, we formed the Life and Natural Sciences publishing team. And there you can see their faces for once as well. So last year we presented two separate webinars regarding assessments. One on the test of a good teacher, in which we looked at the requirements of a good test and how to structure questions effectively. And although we used the FET curriculum and a grade 10 exemplar test to illustrate this, the webinar methodology could still be applied for the senior phase as well. And then the second webinar was specifically geared towards the FET phase on the Bloom's and difficulty levels applied to assessments there. So naturally, we had a call from our senior phase community for a similar webinar or webinars, and we decided to do a compacted version of both of these presentations, but with the senior phase criteria in mind. So today's webinar is going to give you a brief outline of the content cover in the test of a good teacher, and then we'll move on to the specific cognitive levels for the senior phase. So it's a jam-packed session, and we're going to structure the content as follows. We'll start by looking at the common pitfalls for teachers when setting tests and exams so that we can be cognizant of how to maybe avoid them. Then we'll look at the basic requirements, or what I call the non-negotiables, in terms of what is stated in our policy documents regarding our assessments. We'll briefly outline the structural elements of a good question, where to start, how to build it, and basically also just how to approach your formal assessments. And then we'll unpack the senior phase cognitive levels, looking at some worked examples together. And then it's your turn to practice what we've learned today by looking at some practical examples through the poll function. And we'll look at how to fill in a typical cognitive analysis grid as we do those exercises. So as Gretel mentioned, the meeting is being recorded, and the documents that I will be working from will be provided to you as resources, so you can really sit back, relax, and soak up some knowledge. Okay, so let's start with the common pitfalls or mistakes that teachers make when setting tests and exams. And these are things that we must try to avoid. Some of them happen unintentionally, while others happen because we intentionally do not put enough time aside to set our formal assessments or make enough effort with them. And there are about 8 of them, but they're by no means the only pitfalls. They're just the ones that came up most frequently when speaking with teachers, and also in my own experience, especially from things I remember as a novice teacher and having started out in the mistakes I made as well. So if you think of any other pitfalls that you've come across in your teaching career, especially those that are mentor teachers to others, you can pop those in the chat and we'll have a look at them later. Okay, so number one is that we set an assessment that is either too easy or too difficult. And this can happen because we don't make enough time to construct a cognitive analysis grid, or maybe we don't understand how to do that, or even because we just fail to work out our paper holistically and we do it in little fragments as we go. And the problem with that is that we never get a big picture idea of what our paper is going to look and feel like for our learners. Number two is copy and pasting. Copy and pasting an entire paper, meaning we just use something from another province or that I've downloaded from the internet somewhere where learners could have gotten to it too. And this happens because we don't leave ourselves enough time to prepare a good paper. Now, I'm cringing inwardly a little bit, saying this to a bunch of teachers, knowing that I was in your position as well, and I know the time crunch that happens, especially in term 1, with all the extramurals and the athletics and things just stealing your academic time. But colleagues, we have to make time to set formal assessments. We can't just fall back onto finding a whole paper somewhere else and using it as is. Many of you are probably on our WhatsApp groups for the Answer series we have for life sciences and natural sciences, and we'll discuss how to join these groups a bit later. But on groups like that, you often see, especially approaching the exam time, you see teachers asking for March tests or June tests. And as these resources are flying, I hope inside myself that these people are actually using it maybe for resources or for inspiration, and hopefully not copying it as is, because that is one of the common pitfalls. So the problem with this is that, you know, if we use a paper from another school or another province as is, you run the risk of using something that is not suited to the level or needs or circumstances of your own learners. So we have to create time to set formal assessments. And I was usually one of those teachers where everyone was sitting in the staff room at the end of the term drinking coffee and waiting for the holidays. I was copying my notes and my practicals for the next term, because it meant that if those things were done, I could leave myself enough time for my formal assessments, which is not something you can prepare a term in advance, because you don't know whether you're going to get through all that work and how fast you're going to move through it if you even do. So this kind of goes with number 3, which is copying and pasting without adapting to your context, even if it's just a single question. If you haven't, for example, spent enough time teaching density, then it's not fair to copy and paste a question or to use an entire question paper where a lot of marks are being awarded to a section of work that you know you really haven't prepared your learners for. And ultimately, what's going to happen is that both common pitfall number 2 and 3 can inadvertently then affect number 1, making your paper either too easy because whatever you're using as is or copying and pasting is far below the difficulty level of your learners, or too difficult because it's maybe covering work that you haven't done thoroughly, or it's far above the difficulty level of your learners. Number 4 is that we overemphasize a topic or a section of work, giving too many marks to that section of work. And this happens because we don't accurately work out how many marks that section should count, so that it reflects the academic time I've spent teaching it. And I'm actually going to show you how to do that in a later section of today's presentation. So the problem with this common pitfall is that not only can it skew the difficulty of your paper once again, making it, for example, very easy because you've drilled a particular section of work into their heads, you spend too much time teaching it, now you're over-assessing it and it gives the appearance of good marks, but in reality you're neglecting other parts of the work. But it could also disadvantage learners who might have studied other parts of the curriculum, and now you're not allotting a fair portion of marks to that content, so you're disadvantaging learners who studied a broader spectrum of content. Number 5 kind of links to number 4, but it involves more of an unintentional over-examining of work, or what I like to call double trouble. So it essentially means that you're asking the same thing 2 times or maybe even 3 times in the same paper, without realizing it sometimes. So, for example, here on the slide, you have a multiple choice question where learners have to link the release of oxygen to photosynthesis. Then you have a scientific term where you again basically ask for the gas that's released during photosynthesis, and the answer is oxygen. And then maybe you have a question somewhere in section B where respiration and photosynthesis are intertwined in a diagram, and learners have to look at reactants and products. So they're missing the connection with oxygen and photosynthesis in 3 different places. So you're basically penalizing a learner for not knowing that content, even though it might seem very simple, but you're penalizing them in 3 different areas. Alternatively, you could also be advantaging a learner who didn't study much else and give them 3 marks for the same thing that they now know. Number 6 is that we ask questions where we've actually put the answer somewhere in the paper and we don't necessarily realize it. So again, if we look at the multiple choice question, they're linking oxygen to photosynthesis as a process, and you're in the terminology section asking for the gas that's released during photosynthesis, a smart learner would pick up on that correlation. It could even be more explicit, like having a multiple choice question saying something like the acid in the stomach, the hydrochloric acid in the stomach is responsible for ABC. And then you have a question later on with a label diagram and asking them to give the number of, or name the organ that has hydrochloric acid. So they've got the answer in the multiple choice section. Number 7 has more to do with layout errors. So we place questions in areas where learners might miss their mark, especially if it's like a standalone 5 or 6 mark question right at the bottom of a page or at the top, and there's a bulk of other questions that they've worked through, so they kind of just think, oh, they've covered it, and they miss the question in that process. And then number 8, sadly, is one that happens far too frequently, and that is that we don't make time to moderate our assessments, which essentially means that we don't give our learners the benefit of a second pair of eyes to ensure that the paper is actually up to scratch. We have to moderate, colleagues. I say this frequently, it's not about you. it's about the learners. And moderation is ultimately about the learners. It's about giving them that second pair of eyes that makes sure that the paper is on par, it's covering the correct content, it's correctly structured, etc., etc. And I know it's difficult for teachers who might be the only one for that subject in their school, but there are so many ways of reaching out to other people these days. I'm again just referencing the WhatsApp groups as a community group for something like that. If you are in a circumstance where you are the only teacher teaching natural sciences in your little school and you're looking for a moderator, you know, the first thing you should do is reach out to your subject advisor, because they might know of another teacher in the district who's sitting in the same situation. But otherwise, use community groups like the one we have for natural sciences and reach out to that community, even if it's someone in a different province. As long as they're doing the same content in the same sequence, you can actually share the load in that way, and you can connect electronically in that way. Because I think if you think about moderation in this way, for those of you who have learners writing external exams at some point, how would you feel if you were being judged on the marks that they were achieving for that external exam, and you knew that it wasn't being moderated? I mean, all of us would be outraged by that. So why are we allowing our own learners to go through that? We need to moderate our papers. So there they are, the top 8 common pitfalls for teachers. You might have thought of some others, and I just have the chat open here as well, just to make sure that if someone was, for example, giving us some more common pitfalls. And we obviously need to talk about how to limit these, and I've mentioned some ways as we went through them, but I'll refer back to it as we go to our worked example a bit later in the presentation. Okay, but the first step in setting a good test or an exam is actually understanding the basic requirements as stated in the various policy documents. So these are the ones that you always need to have handy. Obviously, your CAPS document, and remember that there is an abridged section 4 that was released just before COVID hit us. And there are amendments to the assessment guidelines, especially a new layout for the cognitive grid that we need to apply. And you can see the relevant page numbers on the slide. And then importantly, your annual teaching plans, because they have to a large extent not replace the CAPS document, but there has been amendments to the content and the assessments as well. And we're using the same ATPs for 2024 that we used for 2023. They can also double up as your pace setter. I know some provinces provide their teachers with beautiful pace setters. If you don't have one, your ATP can act as that, because you just add your dates for starting and ending a chapter and you have your signature there. And it's very important to have some form of a pace setter, because that's going to be useful when you're going to calculate the mark allocation per topic based on your academic time. So you need to have some idea of how much time you spent teaching each of those topics. Now, it is a little bit unnerving that teachers at this point are still asking for these documents on the groups. So just remember, if you're ever in need of a policy document, please do go to our life sciences community page. It's kind of doubling up for both life and natural sciences at this point, but there will be a dedicated natural sciences page in the near future. And you just go to the senior phase downloads and you will have all of this in a one-stop shop. Okay. Right, so you have your policy documents now, and you first have to acquire your non-negotiables from these. And what I mean by non-negotiables are things like, what content am I supposed to be covering? Okay, what topics, according to the ATP, for example, should I be doing in term 1? And it's very fitting to have this webinar today, because yesterday in our natural sciences group, there was quite a lot of conversation about the assessments and confusion regarding, are we doing what the abridged CAPS document is saying? Are we doing what the ATP says, et cetera, and the circulars that were going around? So we felt we wanted to give you a single kind of a program of assessment that places all the necessary detail in one place. And we've done that for grade 7, 8, and 9. So you can see the little resource bubble there, which means that this is one of the things that you can receive at the end of this webinar once we've made it available. And just to show you what this program of assessment looks like and how to engage with it, this is, for example, for the grade 8, you have your term 1 to 4. It shows you the SPA component that needs to be assessed. It shows you the topics that need to be covered, and you can see that they also link up with the assessment. So in the term 1, those are the topics for the test. In term 2, those are the topics for the test. And then the exam at the bottom there in term 3, you'll see covers both term 3 and term 4 content, with a difference in the percentage that they should weigh within the paper. It also shows you the minimum mark allocation according to the policy documents, and then very importantly, the time that should be, according to the ATP, allotted to each of these topics. And that's quite an important column when it comes to calculating how many marks you're going to ask for each of these topics. Now, you'll also see some values in red on this document, okay? And this is where the minimum mark allocation comes in, because there is a minimum mark allocation, but I hope you're not looking for the minimum. So the red values are our suggestion, because let's be honest, a 30-mark test, depending on when you're writing it, we're going to get to that, is not nearly enough for you to adequately cover the content taught in a whole term. I mean, if you just look at term 3, you can't possibly spend 9 weeks of academic time teaching static electricity, electrical transfer, or energy transfer and systems, series and parallel, and that whole chapter on visible light. I mean, I don't know how you get all of that into one term, but nevertheless, you can't spend all that time, all that effort, and push all that content into a mere 30-mark paper at the end. In my humble opinion, that is a waste of your time and a waste of your learners' time. So again, this depends on when you are forced to write that assessment. So the totals we're suggesting here is based on the idea that you are writing this assessment at the end of the term. And I'm going to speak about those of you who are in a very, it's a sad predicament if you're forced to have to write your assessment or your control test in the middle of the term or at the beginning of the term, which essentially means that, half of the content is never going to be assessed because you're not allowed to assess it. For example, terms 1's content in term 2. So I'll talk about how to approach that as well. And we've also given you then, based on our suggested mark total, a possible mark allocation for each of the topics. And I'm going to show you how I calculated that so that you can actually do it for yourself, depending on what your circumstance is. So let's talk about the first scenario, which is you're writing a mini type of essay, a mini exam at the end of the term, and you've covered, let's say in term 1, all 3 topics or at least 2.5 of them, okay? So how you approach this is you first look at your academic time. Now, according to the ATP, you're supposed to spend a total of 9 weeks teaching those 3 topics. There are 11 weeks, I think, set out because they've allotted for things like academic time, getting lost, revision, and assessments being put in. So 9 weeks. And then you basically just work out the ratio that a particular topic would count. So 2 of the 9 weeks was spent on photosynthesis and respiration. And then you just times that or multiply it by the total for your exam to work out how many marks that topic should count to be accurate in terms of the amount of time you've spent on it. And that 13 is a plus minus. So it can be 10, it can be 16. It just can't be double that amount because it's not worth that amount of marks. And you're going to end up possibly doing double trouble errors where you're assessing the same content twice, because that typically pops up when we have too many marks that we're trying to fill with too little content. So that's the one thing that happens with double trouble. And then similarly with interactions and interdependence, of the 9 weeks, you spend 5 teaching that, or however many you've spent, times it by the 60 or the 50 to get the mark allocation. And this is why having a pace setter is important, because you might spend 2.5 weeks on photosynthesis or 4 weeks on interactions and interdependence. It's all very relevant to your context. So now you know kind of the formula of how to do this. And if you are now in a scenario where you are not writing at the end of the term, okay, you only have the opportunity to write, for example, on photosynthesis and respiration, then it makes sense to do maybe a 30 or a 40-mark test. But you're going to have to then look at the content that you have taught. So let's assume you've done 2 of the 3 chapters, right? So you have photosynthesis and respiration and interactions and interdependence, and you can then cover that in a test. So all you do is you adjust your formula. So instead of 9 weeks of academic time, you've now had 7 weeks of academic time. And 2 of the 7 was spent on photosynthesis and 5 of the 7 on the second chapter on interactions. So the formula can just be arranged in that way. And yesterday, the question also came up on our WhatsApp group regarding this thing that we're not allowed to write an exam in term 2. So essentially, if you only get to assess learners in your control test in term 1 on photosynthesis and respiration, they are never writing a formal test on interactions, interdependence, and microorganisms. So my advice, the only advice that I can give in the current predicament we are in, is that you use the practical investigation, your other SPA, to the best of your advantage in that sense. So if you know you're in that situation and you're always going to have to write your test on very little content, make your practical task or investigation a lot thicker or bulkier. Do a practical section, yes, but you can also have a theory section that links to that practical. And you can then force learners, that's something I used to do, is we had practicals over 2 days. So the one day they came in, they did the practical component, they drew their graphs, they worked with the apparatus, etc. And the next day it was kind of a, you do your own work now individually, and you had to study for that content. So just to force them to engage with it in a different way, that's not merely just you teaching it to them, but them actually applying back to chair and memorizing some of it. So that's my best suggestion of how to overcome that issue. Okay, so back to the non-negotiables from our policy documents, just keeping an eye here. Gretel, Liesel, Grace, if there are any things in the chat that you want to bring to my attention, please do. So we've talked about the content that needs to be covered. The other thing that the policy documents would help you with is probably your assessment layout. So what does that have to look like? And it is a bit lenient for natural sciences, but we tend to focus on what's happening in FET and try to structure our assessments in the same format. So typically you would have a section A, which basically means a section of short questions, so multiple choice, terminology, columns and items or statements, and then a section B where you would have more of your application questions, longer questions. And I know it looks a bit different for the physical sciences. You tend to just have question 1, 2, etc. But basically you have those two components. There's no section C because we don't write long questions, etc. And then in terms of mark allocation, we try to stick to a tempo of 1 minute to 1 mark. Again, for physical sciences in the FET, this is slightly more, but generally speaking, if you're writing a 60-mark paper, give them an hour. If you're writing a 50-mark paper, give them an hour. You have a little leeway there. All right, so that's just generally the layout. And then the last thing that your policy documents tell you, and this is why we are here today, is that the cognitive demand of our assessments, particularly our formal assessments, needs to be 40% lower order, 45% middle order, and 15% higher order. And we'll unpack what that means a bit later. So just to reiterate, because I said that I thought a lot about when I was a novice teacher and the mistakes I made when I thought of the common pitfalls and putting this webinar together. And I remember very clearly in my first teaching position that I had to set the natural sciences exam for the grade 9s, and it was 200 marks back then. And I was so excited. I spent the whole day compiling this assessment, and I eventually ended up with a cover page, because we used cover pages, where you had 9 questions, question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 9. And I was so excited about this thing. And I gave it to my mentor teacher, and she's like, it's very nice, but you're going to have to restructure the whole thing, because this is not what a natural sciences exam should look like. I was fairly deflated, because why did no one teach me this when I was doing my PGCE or give me any instruction about it? So in terms of the layout, right, you basically try and look at the NSC exams. And as I've mentioned, we have a section A and a section B. And when you start your paper, the first thing you see is that multiple choice short question section A. That's what I refer to as section A. So you would typically have question 1.1, and that would be your multiple choice. Then you do your terminology at question 1.2, and then question 1.3 might be column A, column B that they need to fit together. There could even be a question 1.4 or a 1.5 with true and false, or some shorter kind of function instruction questions, depending on how many marks you have to play with, right? This is typical. And then in section B, you would start with question 2, question 3, question 4, how many you need. And then in terms of the marks, a multiple choice question, usually 1 to 2 marks. We usually give 2 marks in the FET. That's why I tend to give 2 marks for a multiple choice. And my feeling for that is just that we need to prepare learners in grade 8 and 9 and not fluff them around thinking like, oh, 1 mark question, so it's easier. They kind of need to get used to that idea that this is not what's going to be expected of them in the FET. Maybe I'm a bit mean on that side. But your scientific terminology and your columns here would usually count 1 mark each. Okay, so generally just what I wanted to reiterate here, especially for the novice teachers, is to keep to a standardized exam layout. Don't fiddle around with it and try and make your paper out of 9 questions. Learners need to get used to the format and to the time as in the FET phase. Right, so those are the non-negotiables of your paper. What am I supposed to test? How am I supposed to assess it? And what is the cognitive demand? And now you can start thinking about the negotiables of your paper. In other words, the various process skills or skills that you would like to assess. And there are a whole variety of them, and you can't possibly fit all of them into a single assessment. And you try to spread them out throughout the year so that learners are kind of exposed to all of them eventually. And some of them just don't fit within a formal examination setting. So working with apparatus and taking measurements, for example, would be more suited to a practical, okay? And you can try to fit certain ones in most assessments, things like, for example, making a drawing, so communicating in that way. A scientific investigation covers a whole range of the process skills for the senior phase, and I think that's part and parcel to the reason why we're kind of pushed to include one in every assessment. It's one of the reasons why, and we'll get to the others later. Maybe a mini essay. So again, communicating, getting learners to write something more than just, phrases or one word answers, but a 5 or a 4 mark or a 6 mark question where they have to do a paragraph of some kind. And then maybe asking them to either draw a graph or engage with data in the form of a graph, because that's a skill in itself, is being able to read a graph as well, or doing some or other calculation. And at this point, you're just thinking of skills that you would like to assess based on what you've seen in other papers or what you've done in class might have sparked some ideas for you. But you're not necessarily going to include all of these things in your paper. It's really going to depend on whether it suits the content that you're assessing, whether it's going to fit in the time frame and the mark allocation that you're working with. But this is just kind of a wish list. So speaking of this wish list, let's apply it to an example. Let's consider doing a March test for a grade 9 class, and let's assume it's at the end of the term and you've covered the majority of the life and living content. So if you know the content that you've taught in each chapter well, you will already be able to note which content might suit the process skills that you are thinking about possibly assessing. So which one might fit a scientific investigation because you have some other data that you could use, or which one might be suited to having learners draw a graph or work with data in the form of a graph, or which one could be an essay, like 4 or 5 marks, just discussing the main events in the menstrual cycle, or a calculation of some kind. And something I like to do, and that I'm going to do in our work example today, is also thinking of concepts or topics that could potentially be combined in a question. Because I believe this is a very important skill, especially in sciences. We are not teaching content that sits in little boxes. I mean, if you think about, especially the grade 9 life and living content, it's ideally suited to this because those systems interlink with each other. Especially if you think circulatory system, it supplies blood to all the other systems. So we should get out of that mindset of just asking in little boxes. And again, this is something we see in the NSC exams. They're not asking in little boxes. They're combining content. They're taking content from previous grades. So why aren't we expecting that of learners in the senior phase? If we want them to excel, we should expect that from them as well. So consider again that you might only have 30 marks or 60 marks to work with in your paper, and you don't want your skills to overwhelm the paper because some of them are quite high order, so you're going to have to find that balance once you start setting your paper. But this is a wish list, okay? And you're just noting things you might like to assess, but whether it's going to fit is going to happen when you look at your mark allocation, your time, and when you start setting that exam. Okay. Right, so once I know my non-negotiables and my negotiables, I've had to think about the things that I would like to do, then I can go and sit in front of my laptop and I can start getting my question paper together. So where do you start? And the short answer is not with your multiple choice, not with section A. I know that a lot of us do that because it feels like I can do this evening and I can get it done. But in fact, section A should be last. So the long answer is there's a reason for this. Okay, section A is supposed to act as a filler question section that's going to soak up anything that you haven't assessed or you haven't addressed in section B, your application section. So for example, if you've now followed this procedure and you've set section B first and you realize, I never got around to asking enough marks on the cell then you can fill up on those marks in section A by asking more questions on the cell there. Or if you said, sure, I'm done with section B, but I never got around to putting a graph in there anywhere, or have learners draw a graph. I ran out of marks. Why not put a graph in a multiple choice question? You can do that so that learners still engage with that process skill. Or if you see your section B is looking on the difficult side, I need to try and balance the cognitive levels in this paper. Instead of redoing the whole section B, just try to make section A nice and easy and low order and straightforward so that it balances out. So that's what I mean by section A has to soak up what you haven't assessed and haven't addressed in the rest of your paper. So the answer in the long run is you're going to start with section B, your application section. Right. So another resource that you will receive is this model question on the slide. So I created this based on the grade 9 content because we're looking at a grade 9 March example. And your page is also going to show the cognitive levels of each of the questions here, so you can use it as a guide. And I created this content based on the content in the answer series grade 9 class natural sciences class text and study guide. So you can easily use that if that is your main textbook for teaching. And as I've mentioned, the life and living content is ideally suited to creating combo questions. So I wanted to give you an example of this by linking the cardiovascular system to the digestive system where it gets its blood supply. Okay. And the question that you'll receive is way too long to use as is in an exam. So please don't do that. There are way too many marks on this one section of work, but I wanted to give you a nice resource that A, you can adapt to your circumstances by taking out what you don't feel like asking and having enough left over. And I wanted to include enough questions to show you what a good question looks like and the cognitive progression in it. So I managed, in this combo question that I've created, I managed to fit 15 marks on the digestive system in there and 9 marks on the circulatory system. And I could have gone on. Okay, you'll get it and you'll read it and you'll think, oh, I can ask this and this as well. So you'll easily be able to expand this resource. Okay, so I definitely think a lot of you are looking at this and going, sure, Marika, no way my learners will be able to do this. I can just see immediately it's too difficult a question. And colleagues, that is where the structure of a good question comes in, okay? Because a good question tries to follow a narrative or a story that unlocks and unpacks the content in the question and the diagrams or the graphs or the tables that you've provided the learners. You want to ease them into this question first with the familiar and then moving into the unfamiliar. And we're going to work through the cognitive assessment of each of these questions a bit later. But for now, I basically want to just look at the structure of this question and how I approached it so that you can see that progression and the thinking and the rationale behind it. So if we read the stem of the question, it says the diagram below shows some of the organs in the human digestive system, as well as their blood supply, circulation. Letters A to E indicate different types of blood vessels, and numbers 1 to 5 indicate different organs. The arrows indicate the direction of the blood flow. So the stem of the question already orientates learners to the fact that there are 2 systems visible in this diagram, digestive system and circulatory system. And we have to use, when we're creating questions like this, I always love to give learners a good, thorough stem to a question. I don't necessarily always like questions that just say, study the diagram below and answer the questions that follow. Because that generally tells me that the questions are probably going to be lower order, like name and function, name and function. If you think about a scientific investigation, they provide a very thorough stem to the question, which orientates learners to what's happening because they need that information to make sense of what's going to come. So use the stem of your question to give learners enough information to start unpacking what's presented there, and then use the way you structure your questions to do the rest of the work. Now, we can all agree that the more familiar content here is definitely going to be the pictures of the organs, right, of the digestive system. They should recognize those off the bat, hopefully. So you're going to start with that because it's the easier part. So the first question then asks them to give the number and the name of an organ that regulates blood sugar levels and that contains hydrochloric acid. And you could have made this even more straightforward by just saying name organ 2 and name organ 3, okay? But I wanted to have the combo question in there. And then you move on to another easy kind of question where it's just about giving the numbers of 2 organs that contain enzymes, something that they've learned as part of the classroom knowledge. And then they might move into, sorry, what I want to say here first is, this is recognizable content, right? So you're easing them into this. This is content that they've learned. They just recognize them from the diagram. And then, because the stem of the question talks about different types of blood vessels, then you move into the cardiovascular system. But you do it very gradually and easily, so that the next question now orientates them to the diagram. It asks them, what is the circulation between the heart and the organs called? And that's a very strategic question because it basically tells them what they're looking at. So if they haven't understood what this diagram is up to this point, hopefully now they see, aha, it is systemic circulation. So it's the bottom half where my teacher showed me the picture of the heart and the lungs and the systems. This is the part supplying the organs with blood. So we still have the aorta coming down and the vena cava going up. So it helps them orientate them in the diagram. And then you can ask them things like identifying particular blood vessels, giving visible reasons. And even though this is moving towards a more difficult section of the question, they've had 5 marks to allocate or to accumulate at this point. So they feel like they've achieved something, and you gradually orientated them to this idea of 2 systems, and we're looking at systemic circulation. And then only do you start moving into more difficult questions like comparing structural and adaptations, or explaining adaptations, doing calculations, and evaluating symptoms of maybe unknown diseases. And I'm going through these quickly because we're actually going to look at them again when we get to the cognitive analysis, but I just want you to see this gradual increase in complexity, which guides learners towards actually unpacking the content in the question. So you're not going to start your question with something like 2.1.11, which is about an unknown disease state, and they have to apply their learned knowledge to it. That would completely deflate a learner's confidence, and they might not even attempt answering anything after that. So we'll look at the cognitive levels in a few slides, but the key takeaway here is when you're creating questions, and I really hope that you get inspired to actually do this, even if it's just a case of my New Year's resolution in March is going to be to create at least 1 question that I have constructed for myself in every exam this year. The rest I can copy and paste, but there will be 1 novel new question that I've created because it's really inspiring to try and think of these, and to not be afraid of creating combo questions, but to always think of a narrative. What do learners need to unlock what is being given, the structure of it, what question comes where, and to help learners be guided through the content that's being provided and gradually increasing that complexity, not starting with a higher order question and then having lower order questions, but building on that confidence that they get because they know certain work. So structure the sequence of questions to help them focus on aspects that help unpack the question, and they will be okay. So don't be afraid of a question like this. And I'm going to say this again when we get to, I see there's a hand up. I'm going to get to this when we get to the cognitive analysis, but I kind of want to, my second preach for the day is don't be afraid of higher order questions, because we are legally required to have 15% questions on a high order in our papers. So you have to have questions that you know in your heart, half of my class is probably not going to get this right, but there are going to be kids that will get it right. And that's how you separate the chaff from the wheat, is dit mense sê, kaf van die koring, dink so. Thank you, Bonnie. Bonnie's my sidekick, she's keeping me calm here. So I think the important thing for me as a teacher was always, when you're teaching, especially grade 9s, right? You're teaching organs and systems and life sciences, and they're all like, oh man, I'm going to take life sciences because I love the body. And I'm like freaking out inside because I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to have like 90 learners because they have this misconception that life sciences is just organs and functions and everybody's structures, you know? So you have to, we have to, even if you are not teaching FET, Colleagues, I have to ask you, as someone who did teach FET, we have to work together to get learners into a scientific mind space and understand that what they're going to get in senior phase is not watered down. It can't be watered down all the time. We can't put little fluff around them all the time. You have 15% to work with for your higher order questions. Work with that with 15%, knowing full well that some learners are not going to be able to answer that question. Okay. Klaar gepreek. I see the hand went down, so hopefully the question comes up again later. Something else in terms of a good question structure is that you note the use of Bloom's taxonomy action verbs: give, identify, describe. Why is it important to structure questions with these? Well, because there's more than one way. The only expression I can think of is to skin a cat, and that sounds really horrible, but I know it is. There's more than one way to phrase the same question, and some of them are more problematic when translating, and some of them are more confusing for learners, especially if this is not their first language. So if we look at an example, okay, 2.1.2 currently says, give the numbers of any two organs that contain enzymes. A poorer way of phrasing this question would be, which organs contain enzymes? And this is a poorer phrasing because firstly, you're not adding an action verb, so you're not giving learners a concise instruction. Secondly, you don't mention if they should be providing numbers or names. So technically, a learner could give the name of any organ that has enzymes in it, and you have to now give the mark. So you're opening up your memorandum to that misinterpretation. And thirdly, there's no indication of how many organs need to be provided. They only have the mark allocation to go by. And learners can't read, unfortunately. So many of them will go, which organ contains enzymes, and miss the S. So they give you 1. And if they didn't check the mark allocation, they lose that mark. So notice that the same question can be asked in different ways. But if you stick to the typical convention of using action verbs, like in the NSC exams, ensuring clear and concise instructions, it's going to make it easier for a learner to understand the question and hopefully also answer it in the correct format. And sometimes you have to phrase a question with a which or what or how or why. I'm not saying you're never allowed to do it. I'm just saying don't make it your primary convention, because of the mistakes that learners sometimes make when they have to interpret a question that is phrased in that way. And you'll notice question 213 is phrased in that way, and it's strategically done that way. What is the circulation between the heart and the organs called? Remember, I said that I added that question there because I wanted them to actually realize that the diagram is showing systemic circulation. So I wanted to give them a question that didn't necessarily require them understanding any particular part of the diagram, so that they basically just had a definition and they had to give me a word for it. So it's very similar to a scientific term, which maybe in my heart and in my mind would make them feel more comfortable and capable of answering that question, because it's merely like a scientific term. And in the process, they realize, aha, systemic circulation, wait a minute, that's what this is. Okay. Now that double trouble error I mentioned earlier can obviously creep up into the same question as well, and we have to be mindful of that. So be careful of asking the same question twice, for example, the same label or the same function. So if, for example, in question 211, I asked them for basically the liver, the stomach and the pancreas to identify those two based on their functions, then I preferably shouldn't have questions in the rest of this that again refer to structure 2 and structure 3, where it relies on them recognizing it as that structure, if that makes sense. Because a learner who didn't recognize number 3 as the pancreas in the first question isn't going to suddenly recognize it as the pancreas in the last question. So test different knowledge. And furthermore, if I test their knowledge on identifying the organs here with certain functions, then I have to be careful of what I'm asking in other parts so that I'm not giving the answer, for example, in the rest of the paper. And I mentioned the example of hydrochloric acid. If you have it here as something that they should use to identify the stomach, then you can't have a scientific term or a multiple choice question that says the stomach contains hydrochloric acid. So be careful of that. So double trouble is going to either penalize a learner who didn't study a particular section of the work twice, or it's going to advantage someone who only studied that doubly so. And in my mind, the best way to avoid double trouble And most common pitfalls, if I'm honest, is actually creating a thorough memorandum in a single setting. So in other words, holistically. And again, I'm cringing a little bit inside because I know a lot of you are like, where am I supposed to get 4 hours to sit, consistently creating a test and a memo? And I get it. And to some extent, I can say, okay, I can forgive you for not creating your test in one sitting, okay? Maybe having a collection of your questions that you want to ask and putting them in and keeping track of the memo on the side. But for me, when it comes to actually compiling your formal memo, you need to do it holistically. You need to sit and work out your exam to some extent, the way the learners would, awarding obviously marks to the things that you would award marks to, because you are going to pick up on so many things. You're going to pick up on double trouble. When you write down stomach, mark, why does this feel so familiar? Wait a minute, I've asked stomach in the terminology as well. Or you're going to pick up on things like, wait a minute, this question, sure, it's way too difficult. I am having a hell of a time creating a thorough memo for 4 marks. I can't ask this of my learners. You're going to pick up on having answers in other parts of your paper where you realize you're writing down hydrochloric acid. Again, this feels so familiar. Oops, I provided the answer somewhere else. So actually answering your own questions is going to help you recognize the familiarity in them and a whole bunch of other things. So in my mind, compiling a memorandum holistically in a single sitting is really one of the key things that helps you avoid most of the mistakes that you tend to make. They also just, yes.
There's just a question maybe relevant to your discussion now that asks, can you have the questions with same action verbs in succession?
Yes. There's no reason not to do it that way. Again, it depends on the mark allocation. So even though this is my model question, okay, I told you that I've created more than enough questions to give you an idea of progression. So you might decide to do question 2.1.1, 2.1.3, 2.1.4. Then you don't have give, although there's no rule that states you can't have successive action verbs. We're going to get to action verbs, and the only thing that I want to comment on it now is that the action verb does not necessarily always determine the level of the question, the cognitive level of the question. It's merely a guideline. If you have created question papers where the majority of your questions are give name, give name, give name, you are probably asking only lower order questions. So you have to try to get identify, describe, etc. in there as well. But there's no rule that says you can't have more than one give action verb in a question. I hope that answers it.
Thank you.
Cool.
And I think just while we have a moment, to say thank you so much to the teachers who are sharing some wonderful comments, supportive ideas. So for those who can access the chat, do have it open so that, there's just opportunity to learn so much from each other.
Thanks, Gretel. Just also, I can't read all the comments, but I'm just skimming through on the side here, but I'll pay more attention when we get to the polls section. Okay, so another thing in terms of a good question is just the general layout that you have to keep in mind. So make sure that your diagrams are clear. And this is not just as it appears on your screen or when you print it, but when you photocopy it as well. And then standardize your layout, which means things like keep the spacing the same, keep the margins the same, the formatting. What font am I using? What size font am I using? What am I bolding? What am I keeping in caps? And again, just look at past grade 12 papers to get the inspiration for that formatting if you're not familiar with it. But there are few things that speak to a learner about a teacher's disinterest or lack of time as having a paper that they clearly see you haven't spent a lot of time on. The font is different, the sizes are different, the spacing is different. I think that to me would be as a learner, and there are spelling mistakes, very obvious ones, like in Afrikaans, I've seen papers with ach here in place van acht. So they were asking for ach things instead of acht things. So you don't want to give that impression that you haven't spent time on it because they are worth it, right? An assessment opportunity for me was always exciting because it meant I could see what my learners actually know. And I know it feels like a schlep if you haven't got enough time to really sit and work out a paper that you feel proud of. But A, schedule the time by just organizing the rest of your admin, hopefully, in the time that you have available at school, and B, see it as an opportunity for you to actually get some feedback from your learners. So make it exciting for yourself. It is a very nice opportunity to see VC8 blinkers, who are the stars in your class. And I think we all love those kids. Also note, just in terms of labeling of diagrams, that when you add labels, preferably only add ones that you actually reference in the question. So I could have had multiple other labels here for all the little arrows and diagrams of blood vessels, but that would have been very confusing and distracting and not really useful to my purpose here. Labels that are not required in answers are called detractors because they serve to distract or confuse learners by giving them more options than are necessary. And you can add detractors. And in some instances, it makes sense to add detractors. Just don't add too many, maybe 1 or 2. So in this instance, because question 211 asked them to give the name and number, I obviously had to give detractors because I had to give them more than 2 options to choose from. But if that wasn't the case, if I was only saying name number 2, name number 3, what would be the point of adding other organs and other labels to confuse them when they're not even making use of those labels? So that's what I mean by, be aware of detractors and when they are relevant to your questions. Right, so that is, in a nutshell, the essence of the Test of a Good Teacher webinar. And now we're going to move on to cognitive analysis. So why is cognitive analysis a thing? Why do we request so much training in it and it seems so daunting? Well, because it is a complex topic, and I think it's very laborious and difficult to unpack for a teacher who is already up to their neck in admin. And we want to help simplify it for you and break it down into bite-sized information pieces. And we've noted that there is a lack of understanding and practice for teachers, especially for novice teachers, because in cognitive analysis, obviously, because it's not a given that it's something you're taught at university. And again, I was at a good university, but I was never taught how to do cognitive analysis. I wasn't taught how to moderate. I wasn't even taught how to create a setup of a test. We kind of just studied the curriculum for, I feel like, a year. So it's not a given that this is something you are prepared with as a novice teacher. And therefore, you rely on the support of your mentor teacher or webinars like this to get that information. And then often because it's just that one more thing on the pile of other things that you have to deal with as a teacher, you abandon it, you neglect it, or you don't feel like making time for it. But the reality is that cognitive analysis is a fundamental requirement, ethically and legally, for our assessments to ensure that they are fair, reliable, and valid. Because again, it's not about you. It's about the learners, just as with moderation. It's about ensuring that your learners receive a fair shake when it comes to assessments. And part and parcel to that is ensuring that your assessments are not too easy or too difficult. And that isn't something that you can judge subjectively by, oh, I feel like my paper is on par, okay? You actually have to put pen to paper to prove it. And I'm standing here or sitting here in front of you today knowing that I was a teacher like that, who at one point felt like, I've been doing this for so long, I've experienced for so many years, I think I know when a paper is not on par. Until you actually make time to sit and create a cognitive analysis grid for your paper and you realize, my poor learners, I have been nailing them all this time. So even if you are an experienced teacher, perform cognitive analysis to check on yourself. You might be surprised. And then lastly, we don't always interpret and classify the categories of cognitive demand provided in the CAPs in the same way. And this lends to kind of a subjective nature because, where I think a question is this particular level and you think it's that level, but actually we're not agreeing with each other because neither of us really knows what each level means. So yes, there is going to be differences in opinion. There are going to be disagreements with regards to cognitive assessment or level, but it's important to disagree with the narrow margins, okay? Because there are rules to this. There are guidelines on how to classify a question. And in some instances, there's definitely going to be a right and a wrong classification. So we need to clear up this ambiguity by laying a solid foundation for what is a lower order question, what is a higher order question. So we aim to provide you with that kind of guideline or framework in today's webinar. And when we get to the practical application at the end, we might differ from each other, but it's important to differ within narrow margins. So if I say low order and you can substantiate why you feel like this is definitely middle order for me, fine, but you can't go high order. That's way too big a difference between the two of us. Okay, but more on that when we get to that section later. So I mentioned that we did a similar webinar for the FET phase last year. And as I was preparing for this webinar, I noticed a discrepancy in the way that Bloom's is approached in the FET compared to the senior phase. And I think it's confusing and it has to be addressed in some way. So just if you didn't know, the FET phase for the life sciences, specifically now I'm looking at our webinar we presented, you have a level A, which is just knowing. You have a level B for understanding, a level C applying, and a level D analyzing, evaluating, synthesizing. So if you think in terms of low, middle, and high, knowing would be low order. Being able to understand and apply is considered middle order, and then higher order is evaluating, analyzing, synthesizing, etc. And that makes sense to me. But then you get to the revised cognitive analysis kind of layout for the senior phase, and suddenly you have 6 levels. And now understanding is no longer middle order, it's lower order. And analyzing is no longer higher order, it's a middle order. So I think this is a bit confusing. If anyone can clear it up for me why there's a difference, I would really appreciate it. But it feels almost like it's being more strict for the senior phase in terms of cognitive analysis than for the FET with these 6 daunting levels and all of these action verbs. So yeah, I did eventually try and figure it out for myself, and I did. That's why we have the webinar. But this is basically the grid or the table that you find in the abridged document, the abridged CAPS document. And these action verbs that you see there are not necessarily all applicable to natural sciences. I mean, we don't omit or recite or construct or design. So the ones that we typically use more frequently that are implied in most of our questions are kind of highlighted for you. And as you hopefully know, that the same action verb can occur on more than one cognitive level. It really depends on the context of the question. So you'll see that something like explain could be middle or higher order, depending on the context of the question. Okay, but nonetheless, I decided to approach this 6-level table in a similar way to FET by just focusing on low, middle, high, and what is usually in a familiar context, what is usually in an unfamiliar context to make sense to this or to make sense of this for myself. So lower order questions is a case of either understanding or remembering, okay? And remembering involves recalling information that you've learned, like terms or basic concepts or answers to things that were given in class. And understanding means being able to translate that. That word to me is always very important for understanding. Yes, they talk about organizing and comparing, but translating for me basically means that I understand the work so I can actually put it into a different language, or I can explain it in my own words. For example, typical understanding question will require learners to translate verbal instructions into a drawing of some kind. So you've taught them the structure of a plant cell, or they know the structure of a plant cell, and then in an exam you say, draw a plant cell with a nucleus, 1 large vacuole, 3 mitochondria, 4 chloroplasts. And they need to understand that verbal instruction in order to translate it into a drawing. And that indicates understanding for me. And then also remember that typically lower order questions occur within a familiar context. So something that is explicitly stated in caps. So low order, remember, understand, familiar context. Okay. Then your middle and higher order questions occur within an unfamiliar context, not explicitly stated in caps. So you are exposing learners to, for example, a disease state that they didn't learn about in class, or a scientific investigation that they didn't learn in class, because technically most scientific investigations would be middle to high order because they always occur in an unfamiliar context. You're not going to ask the same one in every single exam, hopefully. They have done the methodology on the scientific investigation, but then the questions on it will be posed in a different setting, a different experiment, and they have to apply their understanding of how to identify variables, how to write an aim to that understanding. So middle order questions, we're going to remember the words apply and analyze. So apply is involved with taking your acquired knowledge, so what I remember, what I understand, facts, rules, etc., and using it in a different way. And I like to remember calculations as a very good example of what application means, because if you think about it, a calculation always requires application. It always requires learners having been taught a formula, remembering the formula, but then they have to use that formula, apply it in a novel circumstance where you are giving them data to input that they haven't been exposed to before. So using it in a new way, in a novel way. That to me always helps me remember what applying is. Analyzing is breaking information into parts, making inferences. So why did the researcher use 100 participants instead of 10? What would be the purpose of that? Analyzing the question. And then higher order questions are evaluate and create. And I also like to think of the word synthesize. So putting together everything you've learned in order to answer this question. And I think in IEB cases, they reach the level of creation a bit more than in CAPS, in the sense that often within IEB, learners are expected to motivate, give their own opinions or arguments for things, which we rarely do in CAPS, but we definitely reach a synthesizing, evaluating level where learners have to put together what they've learned in order to answer this question. Okay, so this table that we've color-coded with its action verbs is another resource that you will be able to receive, even though it is available in your abridged CAPS document. And we're going to now look at how to apply this to our worked example, our question that we did earlier, the one that I created. Okay. Right, so the first few examples for this one, I'm going to work through them with you and tell you about my reasoning for applying the particular level of cognitive analysis, and then we're going to do practice questions with a polls function at the end. Okay, so we've read the stem of the question, so we're going to look at the individual ones. We know now question 211 says, give the number and the name of the organ that regulates blood sugar levels and that contains hydrochloric acid. And there you can see the memorandum for the question. And I think the question is just stating the function. Learners must merely recall the organ that performs that function and then relate it to the drawing on the diagram. So I think we can all agree this is definitely a lower order, remember, recall, understand type question. Okay, so that's easy peasy. And again, we started our question with a lower order question. Okay, question 212 says, give the numbers of any two organs that contain enzymes. And there you can see the memorandum, options 2, 3, and 5 are provided. And again, this is going to be a familiar context. Learners were taught which organs contain enzymes. They merely need to recall the name of the organ and relate it to the picture. So understand how it's being represented on the diagram. So recall, recite, understand, lower order. All right. Now let's skip to a question that is a bit more difficult. Question 214 and 215. So 214, we haven't looked at these in detail. It says identify the type of blood vessel represented by C. Okay, so learners know that there are 3 types of blood vessels and they hopefully know their names, but this is part of the familiar, right? Okay, they should know differences between them, like, for example, the thickness of the wall, the valves that are present or not, etc., etc. But these structural differences are not visible on this very unfamiliar diagram. So this for me is an unfamiliar context, which immediately tells you it's middle or high order. So all they have to go by on this diagram is the direction of blood flow. So an unknown context, they have to remember the 3 types of blood vessels, understand what has been provided in the diagram in terms of them being able to actually see the blood vessels, and then apply their knowledge in order to identify that C is an artery. So this for me is a middle order question. And the next question links to this, right? Question 214 links to it, where it asks for give one visible reason for your answer. I actually neglected to mention something when we went through the model question earlier. And it's also regarding the structure of a good question. One of the other things is to actually try and limit your instructions to one per question. So what I mean by that is I could have easily made question 214 a combo question. So it would have said, identify the type of blood vessel represented by C and give one visible reason for your answer. But questions like that tend to be more difficult for learners. The phrasing sometimes trips them up and they end up only answering half of the question instead of giving both answers because there were two instructions in. So my feeling is, and we do see this in the NSC exams, they tend to separate the questions like this because it feels more manageable and we make certain that learners are actually performing one instruction per question. It's not saying never do it, never put them together. You can do that. But I think for especially the lower grades, we might want to structure questions this way just because it feels easier for them to handle. Okay, it's more manageable. But anyway, getting to question 215, which asks for a visible reason. So this question basically is the thought process behind question 214. So you'll see the memorandum says it transports blood away from the heart, it transports blood towards the organ cells or tissues. And the two are linked together. So that's why it's for me a middle order question, because again, in order to actually give a response here, learners have to remember the three types of blood vessels, understand what information has been given for them to identify, apply that to the specific diagram in order to identify that the only thing they have is blood flow, and blood flow therefore can be my reason, and that's how I identified it. So you can see the steps, right? Understand, or remember, understand, apply. That's what they're climbing. So they're taking what they've learned about blood vessels and applying it to this new context. And now you might think that this is a lower order question because the answer is visible on the diagram, right? A learner could easily just have said it transports blood away from the heart. And yes, okay, you are going to get your odd learner that just trips into the correct answer because they can read on the diagram. But in my mind, these two questions are linked together. So technically, they are going to struggle to get to 214's answer if they don't actually have the methodology of 215 in mind. And that's why I felt this was also a middle order question. Okay. Okay, skipping again, let's go to that difficult part of the worked example 217. It says that E represents a capillary network. And then it asks two questions. The first one says, name the process that occurs inside a capillary network to provide oxygen to the cells or tissues. And the options there are diffusion or gaseous exchange. So this is, again, a lower order question. Okay, it's merely a definition of something that they've learned. They just need to recall the process that occurs within a capillary network. And I've added it there as a lower order question, again, to ease them into what's going to happen next. So now we have question 217B, which says, capillaries transport blood under a very low pressure and have very thin walls. Explain why these two characteristics are important in the functioning of a capillary network. So the answers that could be provided for the 2 marks, you can see there, very thin walls allow for faster diffusion of gases, 1 mark. Very low pressure provides slower blood flow or more time for diffusion, 1 mark. Or alternatively, they could have interpreted as linking the two together. So the thin walls would burst if the pressure were high, or the thin walls do not burst because the pressure is low, something to that extent. So here learners are presented with knowledge that they were taught, right? The characteristics of the capillary blood vessels, thin walls, low pressure. But now they have to evaluate the importance, the relevance of those characteristics in light of the functioning of a capillary vessel. And as I'm looking at the memorandum now, you could technically have added a 3rd mark where they basically would have had to say something about along the lines of, if it were to burst, it wouldn't be able to exchange gases, there would be internal bleeding, something like that. Or if it does, because it doesn't burst, it's able to allow blood flow to the tissues, etc., etc. So the idea behind this is it's higher orders because learners cannot just recall structural characteristics. They have to actually apply what they know about the structural characteristics to the function and give kind of an idea of its importance, its irrelevance, evaluate that in light of this question. Okay, so that is a higher order question. Right, question 210. Says the average length of organs 4 and 5 are provided below. Organ 4, 0.3 meters, organ 5, 7 meters. Calculate how many times longer organ 5 is than organ 4. Show the calculations and round off to the nearest whole number. And there you can see the memorandum. So remember that I said calculations are always in the sphere of application, because learners are taught a formula for volume or density or how to calculate a ratio, and now they are confronted with this in a familiar context. And strangely enough, a similar thing was asked in the NSC exams at the end of last year, and learners did not know how to calculate a ratio. They struggled immensely. They did all other types of calculations except the right one. So this is definitely not lower order. It's a middle order. You might be able to argue higher order if you think this is a very difficult calculation. But for me, calculations fall within the application sphere because learners have to apply their knowledge of the formula in a novel setting. Okay, and an unfamiliar context. And then let's look at the last question, 2.1.11. Okay, it says there is a condition in cattle where the lining of organ 5 becomes smooth. Consequently, the cattle become weak and waste away. They die. Explain why this condition will have such an effect. So if you look at the memorandum, it says the loss of villi reduces the size of the surface area or the absorptive surface area. And if it's in brackets like that, it means the mark is not necessarily on that topic or on that mark. It could be just surface area. Fewer nutrients are absorbed, or the rate of absorption is decreased, and the animal does not receive enough nutrients or food to survive. They therefore starve, something along that lines. So I think we can all instinctively feel this is a higher order question, because this is clearly an unfamiliar context, right? It's a disease state that learners were not taught explicitly in class, and they have to recognize organ 5 as the small intestine. They have to remember that it has a villi lining on the inside, understand the function of that villi, and then its significance in the absorption of nutrients, evaluating that then in the light of this disease's symptoms. So typically, when learners are confronted with stuff like this, we see it in the grade 12s as well, when they're given a disease state of any kind, they typically respond to the question by just stating the function. So most of them would actually say, the lining of organ 5 is the villi, and it increases the absorptive surface area. No marks, because they're not stating what is happening in the absence of the function. It is not explaining what will happen when the villi are not there, or how this actually leads to the symptoms of wasting away and dying. So definitely higher order question. And again, I want to reiterate, you might be looking at this and thinking, never I can ask this of my learners. Hulle gaan dit nooit kry nie. You have a responsibility of 15% higher order questions in your paper. Learners are not going to all get this right, and that's okay. That's the whole point of higher order questions. We can't put them in little cotton balls. Okay, right, so that's the whole worked example. This is the one that you will receive, where you see the little dots next to the question that then highlights the cognitive analysis of that question, and you can then use that as a guideline, not only for how to structure a question effectively, but also how to build on that cognitive progression. Okay, and even though you might jump back to lower order or middle order questions, the importance is that you don't see red dots right at the beginning of the question. Okay, you're building on that cognitive progression. Now, we've covered a lot of content in this webinar, and we want to get to that practice question for the group. But I have to mention scientific investigations, because most of the questions here will be on a higher or middle order. Sorry, I'm just getting a message here. Oh, nice question. Okay, so apparently there's a question on the chat. It asks, how do you know where to allocate marks? I'm assuming you're referring to the memorandum. Well, I think in some instances it's easier than others. So if you have like a name or a state, etc., it's quite easy where the mark needs to go. When it gets to explain questions, and I think it might make sense when we look at the practice examples as well, there are a few of them that will work for the memo. You basically have to look at, firstly, don't give marks for things that are in the question. So if I just go back here, let me see. If there was an example of this somewhere. I think there was. Oh, now I can't remember. So if something was in the question, right, then you wouldn't give a mark for them writing that in the answer. If we look at something like this, very thin walls, etc., you're going to focus your marks on where they're actually giving you the answer to the question. So if it's not necessarily just words, it's typically phrases for longer questions. So very thin walls allow for fast diffusion of gases. That is a concept that would answer the question. So that tells me what the purpose of very thin walls was. Very low pressure provides slower blood flow. And when you have a dash on the side, it means that whatever is after the dash could have been, is it a dash near Disney? What is that? Is a dash. Forward slash. It means that whatever is after the forward slash would have been an alternative phrase to the mark. So a learner would have said very low pressure provides slower blood flow. So the concept here is slower blood flow, or very low pressure, more time for diffusion. So if you think about it, the question asked them, what is the purpose of the very low pressure? So you're not actually emphasizing your mark for the first part of the answer. Very low pressure is not where the emphasis goes. The emphasis goes on the function of that, provides slower blood flow or provides more time. So I think you get into a feel for this. Again, if you've had some experience with marking, is a great way to know where you're going to put your marks. But basically, your tick marks need to go where learners are answering the question. And there's a very nice one in the practice that we're going to get to on density that I'll give you an example of a, what do we call it? Where there's an asterisk, a compulsory mark that I wanted to show you, which could highlight that as well. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, so back to this slide about scientific investigations. All scientific investigations, as I've mentioned, occur within an unfamiliar context. So it immediately places everything that's happening there, unless it's like a definition, into a middle or higher order sphere. And that is another reason why we are kind of, shoved to include scientific investigations in our assessments, because if you have that 15% higher order, you're actually ticking quite a lot of those boxes already by just having a scientific investigation in your paper. So yeah, one of the reasons. And this particular one comes out of our new grade 8 class text and study guide for natural sciences. It's part of the worked example at the beginning of the book, which you can use as a tool to teach your learners how to engage with scientific investigations. And for the novice teachers joining us today, it's an invaluable tool to actually show you how to engage with scientific investigations. And we've included as many scientific investigations as possible in this new publication to actually show you how to use them in exams and to expose learners to them for the various topics. Now, if we look at the questions there, you see the red and the orange dots, high and middle order questions. And even the same type of question could be phrased in a way that makes it higher order instead of middle order. You wouldn't necessarily include both of them in your question, but let's look at the example here. Question 2 says, state 2 controlled or fixed variables in this investigation. So that is a middle order question because immediately it requires analysis of what has been given and application of knowledge. Learners have to go and read through that whole stem in order to look for things that the scientists have kept constant. But then just a tweak in the way that you phrase it. Question 3 says to state any 2 factors that should have been kept constant, which means it's not given. Learners need to think for themselves. They need to create an answer to some extent, evaluate, if I did this experiment, what other things would I have had to control that aren't mentioned? So that is a way in which you get the higher, the low. So scientific investigations basically are where we get our higher cognitive levels, and that's part and parcel of why we need to include them in our assessment. Okay, right, almost at the practical part. I want to just quickly talk about a cognitive analysis grid, because what we're going to do next is not only the practical part, sorry, We're also going to look at how to input data into this grid. So this is another resource that you will receive. We've had some questions on the group about this in the last week or so. So you'll get one of these, and this one has been filled in somewhat. I just want to see if I can just access my Excel. Here we go. Okay. So you should be seeing, hopefully, Bonnie, if you can just confirm for me, my Excel spreadsheet. Okay, great. So this is what you'll get, and we have it in Afrikaans and English. And typically, you would have your grade filled in here, whatever term, test, or exam is involved. And then you have a column for question numbers, so 1.1, 1.2, etc. How many marks each question counts. Here is where you're going to classify the marks into low, middle, or high. And then you typically have a topic column as well, so it's in red for you to change it, because as you input marks into these columns, it's going to count up at the bottom, so that you can see how many marks the total is for your paper, what is the percentage for each level, and are you roundabout on par to the 40, 45, 15? And it's also going to show you the totals for each topic, which hopefully you've calculated so that you know you're supposed to be assessing X amount of marks for each of those topics. All right, so we're going to show you how to fill this in when we get to the cognitive analysis application in a bit. So just to get back to my presentation. All right. Okay, so we're finally at the interactive examples. So let's apply what we've learned today. All right. Yes.
Can I just grab this moment while we're in between stages of the presentation? There are many people that maybe weren't in right at the beginning that are asking about recordings and resources. So I think just an opportunity to let everybody know that there will be a feedback form. You might have seen it earlier in the chat already, to get your details so that we can let you know. The recording and the resources will be made available by the end of the week. So watch out for that feedback form and make sure to fill it in so that we have your details to let you know.
Thanks, Gretel. Yeah, so don't worry. I know you're always very worried that you're going to miss something. If you've gotten an email from me, if you're on the WhatsApp group, you will know where to find these things. Okay, so don't worry about that. And we'll also share the details regarding the WhatsApp group at the end. Okay, so what's going to happen now is that we're going to share a question on the screen, and I want you to decide what level of Bloom's taxonomy it falls under. Is it low, remember, understand, middle, apply, analyze, or high order, evaluate, create, synthesize? And as Gretel mentioned, we're going to do this using the polls function in Teams. So for some of you who have not experienced the polls function before, I just want to kind of highlight some of the things that are going to happen. Please do note that it is very dependent on the device that you use. And for some reason, if you are an external participant, it might limit on Teams your accessibility to certain features. So we've done this before, and people who couldn't see the poll, it never popped up anywhere. The solution to that is just use the chat for us. So just write question number and what order, low, middle, or high you think it is, because we do want to hear your voice. So basically, we're going to pop a question on the screen, and then the poll will come up after we've had a discussion about the question. The poll will come up and it will ask you something like, what is the cognitive analysis for question XYZ? And you will always only have the 3 options to choose from: low, middle, or high. And the important thing is to click on your answer and click the submit button, please. Otherwise, you are not going to see the next screen that comes up, which shows you everyone else's responses with yours in. So you can actually see where am I in terms of the group. If it doesn't pop up on your screen, again, this is device dependent. Gretel mentioned that it will always be in the chat area, so you can just open the chat. And I know it's a bit cumbersome toggling between the slide and the chat and the slide and the chat. So we're going to have a thorough discussion of the question and then the poll, and hopefully you would have time to have thought about it. Also, go with your gut instinct, okay? You can change your vote if you want to, but it's not about being right or wrong. And this is completely anonymous, right? We're not collecting names. You are an anonymous voter on this multiple choice poll. So it's really about just going with your gut feel and learning from the experience, okay? So we've selected 9 questions that we're going to go through with this polls function. And remember that, yes, we might disagree with each other, and that's completely fine if you feel like you can substantiate why this is not a lower or a middle order question. And feel free to add that to the chat as well, but we're going to hopefully disagree within narrow margins and preferably agree on most. Okay, so Adriette is in the behind the scenes here. She's another colleague that's going to handle the polls function for us. And we're going to do a little test poll first, because I know you're freaking out, like, is this going to work on my device? So we're going to try it and you can see what your functionality is. So the first poll that Adriette is going to post, and she can go ahead and do that now, is going to basically just ask you, are you ready to apply what you've learned today? And you're going to have a few options to choose from. So try and see, where does this pop up? Is it in my chat? Is it happening on my screen? Am I getting the options to actually do a poll at all? And then cast your vote, obviously, right? So yes, no, maybe. And at this point, I'm going to have to switch my persona to a sports commentator, because I'm going to have to toggle through what's happening in the chat on my phone and talking to you guys there. And the reason for this is obviously that we can't record the poll. For those people watching the recording, they can't see the poll. They can only hear my voice explaining what's happening on it. Right, so we see 47 responses so far. I'm hoping that there's just a lag, you know, in the internet a bit, but it seems like the majority of us are in the yes area, which is fantastic. There are some maybes, people who are a bit tentative about their experience and whether they can do this. Let me just also vote yes. Okay. So if you've had any issues with the poll and you've now seen like, okay, it isn't popping up on your side, as I've mentioned, please just use the chat for us and cast your vote there. I will obviously tell you what your options are, and it will usually just be low, middle, or high. So you can easily do that in the chat. Okay. Righty-yo. Let's jump into the first interactive example. Okay, so we're going to start off with a few multiple choice questions. First one on the screen. Which of the following diseases is caused by a virus? Our options are tuberculosis, athlete's foot, AIDS, and typhoid fever. And hopefully all of us know that the answer is AIDS. Okay, so Adriette is going to post the poll for this multiple choice question number 1. Check your chat, or it's popping up on your screen, and choose, is this low, middle, or high order question? I see a hand going up there. I don't know, whilst we're waiting for the poll, whether we could take the question. The hand went down again. Maybe it was a mistake. Karin de Jong. Yeah, okay. It comes up and it goes. Right, so we start seeing the votes rolling in, and we have 98% voting for low order. So that's definitely the majority here. If we look at the comments in the chat, we see low, 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 low. How low can you go? Okay, awesome. 62, 63 responses. I wonder how many we are today. We're over the 300. Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Okay, low order seems to be the general consensus in this little bit of time that we've spent. Karim de Jong, I see there's a hand up again. And then it disappears. I'm assuming this is because of having to toggle between the two screens. Okay. Right. Okay, I think we can reach the consensus. Low seems to be the best response here. So I can definitely say that we agree. We don't have to agree to disagree. This is by surety a low order question. So it is a familiar context. These are all diseases that learners were explicitly taught in class, and all they need to do is remember which one is caused by the virus. Okay, so most assuredly, low order. Now, if we were to input this into our cognitive analysis grid, this is how you would do it. So you would add your question number, 1.1.1, how many marks your multiple choice question counts. So I'm assuming 2 marks, it could be 1. And then the same 2 marks are put under the column for low order so that it eventually counts up the number of low order marks. And the same 2 marks are awarded to the topic of microorganisms so that it counts up all the marks for microorganisms. Okay, easy peasy. Okay, next multiple choice question. What will happen in the following food web if number 2 became extinct? Okay, so if we remove number 2 from the food web, then immediately we see number 5, that's its only food source, so it's going to starve. But that's not an option on the multiple choice. Okay, so the next one is we look at number 4. Number 4 eats number 2, but it's one of 2 food sources. So if half of its food goes extinct, then obviously the numbers of number 4 will decrease, but that's also not an option in the multiple choice. So if we look then at number 1, which is being eaten by number 2, if one of its so-called predators then, even though that is definitely some other plant, a herbivore, is going to be eating it, if it goes extinct, then it means that there will be more of number 1. So its numbers will increase, and therefore the answer to this multiple choice is D. So considering the question, considering what I've gone through now, having to get to the answer, is this low, middle, or high order? So Adriette, you can go ahead and post the poll for multiple choice question 2. All right, there we have it. We already have 20 responses. They're coming in hot for middle order. We have higher order here coming up the rear, but it's not nearly enough. So we see about 89% saying middle order. If we look at the chat, we're going middle, 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 middle. Application, yes, let's see, middle, middle, middle. We have a few low orders. That's fine if that's your gut feel. 52 responses, 45 of them saying middle order. Right, and it seems to have stagnated. My Wi-Fi isn't wonderful on my phone, so it comes through in spurts. But anyway, okay, so the tribe has spoken. We have 86% saying middle order, and I definitely agree with you. So this multiple choice question basically requires learners to recognize a food web, but they must apply their understanding of what a disturbance to a food web is going to do by analyzing its impact in this instance. So this is an unfamiliar context. Yes, food webs are familiar, but this is an unknown food web. So an unfamiliar context where learners need to apply their understanding of moving things out or into a food web, disturbances in it. So middle order, well done. So going back to our cognitive analysis grid, same system applies. Question 1.1.2 in the white column, then 2 marks for the multiple choice, those same 2 marks under middle order, and those 2 marks relate to the topic of ecosystems and interdependence. Okay. Multiple choice question number 3. A learner performed the following investigation to determine if sunlight is needed for photosynthesis. The leaf of a green plant was distarched and then treated as shown in the diagrams below. The leaf was left in the sunlight for 48 hours before it was tested for the presence of starch. And then they give detailed steps to the investigation with lots of marks. There's also the adding of tin foil on both sides of the leaf and a triangle shape cut out of the tin foil. And then the question asks learners, after the 48 hours in the sunlight, which of the letters on the leaf in step 3 will test positive for starch? So those would be the letters that were exposed to sunlight, X, Y, and V. So the right option is B. Okay, so considering all of this knowledge, Adriette, you can post poll for question number 3. Test or cast your vote. Is this middle, low, or high? Okay. I'm looking at the comments coming in, and its majority is leaning towards high order. In terms of the poll, we don't have as many responses yet, but it's a bit of a tight race between middle and high order. High order is creeping up again here. It's going to 60, 62. Middle order, right about half that. And we're getting more responses coming in. So definitely leaning towards middle and high. More of the comments now coming in mid, mid, mid. Still some high order. Okay. Right, 42 responses, and it's still a tight race between middle and high order questions. Sure, 24, 20 people voting either side. Woo, woo, woo. And then my phone bombs me out. Great. Okay, about 51 responses, and we still have a very tight race here between middle and high order. So let's put you out of your misery. So this multiple choice question, I felt, was a high order question, okay? It requires learners to recognize to some extent the whole process of testing for starch, but it is placed in an unfamiliar context with the addition of the tin foil and cutting out the shape and now having to remember that the areas exposed to sunlight are going to affect the outcome of the experiment. Because technically, I know some of you are teaching this to your learners, but in CAPS, the only requirement is that learners must be able to test only for starch. So a variation to that is automatically in an unfamiliar context. I don't necessarily disagree that you could argue that it would be a middle order question if you feel like this is only analysis and, you know, application of knowledge to this. I just felt like they had to evaluate the outcome of this experiment based on how you've manipulated it. So that put it for me in a higher order bracket. Okay. But agree to disagree if you feel strongly middle order. And again, same rationale applies to the cognitive analysis grid question 1.1.3, 2 marks under the total mark allocation, 2 marks under high, and 2 marks under the topic in question, photosynthesis and respiration. Okay, going to look at 2 more multiple choice questions because now I want to try starting to confuse you. Okay, another one, it says, the diagram shows light of various colors striking an object. Some of the color wavelengths are reflected, some are absorbed, and some pass through. Which option below correctly identifies the color of the object when viewed from above and below, respectively? So we can see that the red color there moves through the object. So from below, it should be viewed as red. Green is absorbed and blue light is reflected, and only reflected light can be taken in by the eye and observed and interpreted by the brain. So viewed from below, red, viewed from above, blue. And the correct option there is then D. So considering this, the poll for question number 4, multiple choice question number 4 will be posted, and you can decide, is this low, middle, or high? Right. So let's see what's happening, Okay, we start seeing some highs and middles. Is the poll for this posted yet? Doesn't look like it. But red might be having some trouble. There we go. Thanks, Eta. Right, so question number 4, for those of you who have access to the poll, you can now cast your vote. Is this low, middle, or high order? What do you think? Low, middle, or high? You sing high, high, middle, middle. Sounds like a song. High, high, middle, middle, low, low, middle, middle. Okay, we start seeing a lot, again, a big competition between middle and high, middle and high, middle and high. 51%, 48%. Now we're 50-50. Let's see what happens. Cast your vote. Let the tribe speak. A lot of the comments seem to be leaning towards majority, towards middle. We still have middle, high, very close together. Now middle is taking over for some reason. Where are you? 52 responses, 53 responses. Okay, we're almost at the number of responses we had for our previous poll, so I think we can actually call it. So it seems like the tribe has spoken for a middle order question. I said this was high. So for me, again, we can agree to disagree. This is an unfamiliar context. I think we agree on that. Definitely, middle or high. Learners have to recognize the context of light that's being applied here. Okay, they have to apply their knowledge of what each ray diagram means as it's moving to this block or through this block or from this block. But then again, evaluating the object and how it's going to be viewed from two different perspectives. You could have felt maybe that is just for you analysis. So middle order, I can see how you get there. For me, it feels like it's taking in the knowledge, applying what they've known, analyzing the diagram, and then evaluating what does it mean for the two perspectives that I'm looking at, from below and from above. And that's why I felt this was a higher order question. Okay, but we were very close there. Definitely disagreeing within narrow margins, if at all. Okay, last multiple choice question, and then we'll look at some more section B type questions. Picture A, B, and C show 3 thermometers at different temperatures. Representations 1, 2, and 3 show the particles inside the thermometers. So you can see that the pictures there, A is a very cool thermometer, B slightly hotter, C very hot. And then the particles in number 2, they're quite densely packed. Number 1 slightly further apart, and number 3 very far apart. And then the question asks, which number diagram, 1, 2, 3, best represents the particles inside each thermometer A to C? So in this instance, we're going to look at kind of the expansion and contraction. And the correct answer here would be number B, where the thermometer that is very cold will have the number 2 particles tightly packed. The thermometer that is slightly hotter like B would look like number 1. The particles are a bit more expanded. And then number 3, which is very hot, far expanded particles. So Adriette, you can post the poll for multiple choice question number 5. And you can cast your vote. All right. Okay, we're seeing some finna out of the gates. Middle orders coming in here. And in terms of the chat, middle. Ha, middle. Late indeed. Yeah. Okay, we're still seeing a very big leaning towards middle order. We're seeing about 20% going higher order. We're seeing about 9% for lower order. And middle order is now almost 70%, getting to the 60 responses, which is wonderful. So considering our time, I'm going to call it. And I'm going to say that I agree with the majority. This is a middle order question. It's definitely an unfamiliar context. Learners have to recognize that this has to do with expansion and contraction and the effect that heat plays in this. Then they have to apply their knowledge to determine which sequence is correct. So analyzing also comes in here. And I felt this is a middle order question, but I could definitely agree for those of you who felt higher order, because you might have felt like, but they are actually having to evaluate which one goes where. It's more than just selecting one option. It's actually putting things together. So I get that. I felt middle order for this one, but disagree within narrow margins. Okay. So we're not far from the end. Please hang around until the end. We do have time until past. So moving on to section B, we're going to do some of these questions on the slide here. And this is now based on matter and materials. Right, so same reasoning applies. We're going to just read the question and then discuss and do the poll. Identify, stem of the question. 3 substances, X, Y, and Z, are shown below. The images in the circles show the arrangement of the particles that make up each substance. Question 2.1, identify the state of matter of substances X and Z respectively. X is a solid and Z is a liquid. Right, so Adriette, you can post the poll for question 2.1. Look at the memo, look at the question. Is this low, middle, or high? Right, there you have it. And we have out of the gate, low order coming in quite strong. We have high order, some middle order coming in here at about 10%. Low order is still in the lead with an 84%. And in terms of the comments, we're going low, 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 middle, low, middle, low, 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 low. I was wondering which song I'm thinking of. Yes. Fans goes low, 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 low. Right, we have about 46 responses so far and at 86% leaning towards low order, 8% middle order, and 4% higher order. So I think we can call this one. This is a lower order question, ladies and gentlemen, because it is a familiar context. Based on just looking at the pictures, learners would have been able to see that X is a solid and Z is a liquid. If that wasn't enough information, the particles that they see could also have alluded to that fact. So it is merely remembering the structure of a liquid, a solid, both physically, but also on a molecular level. Okay. Question 2.2. Explain which substance's particles, X or Z, will have the highest average kinetic energy. And here we have the answer, substance Z, because its particles are further apart or they have larger spaces between them, which allows them to move more freely or fast, and therefore they have more kinetic energy. And here is a classic example of where you would put a tick mark, because the question asks, which one will have the highest average kinetic energy? You actually don't give a mark for them saying substance Z has the highest kinetic energy because it's in the question. So they actually have to provide an explanation for it. So if you look at the second sentence, they allows the particles to move more freely, and then you have that /. Technically, you would only provide the mark to the option fast, right? Have more kinetic energy should actually just be in brackets because it's part of the question and it shouldn't be part of the answer. It shouldn't be considered for a mark. Okay, anyway, Adriette, you can post the poll for this question and then we can have our vote for question 2.2. Is this low, middle, or high? Right, so out of the gate, we have middle order coming in quite strong. We have definitely got some low orders there, about 11%. And we have in the chat, low, middle, middle, middle seems to be the leaning. Let's see, we have about 47 responses, leaning very strongly to middle order. We have about 10% low order and high order about 7% around about there. Okay, so let's call it. Okay, here I disagree, the majority, but I can definitely see how you get there. I put it as part of my explanation. So for this question, I think you might think it is a middle order question just because of the word explain. But for me, oh wait, not for me. Remember that an action verb does not necessarily indicate the level of a question. It is merely a guideline. And to answer these questions, learners have to remember that kinetic energy is the energy of motion, and then just basically provide to some extent a definition for it. That was my feeling. It was more like looking at the picture and seeing there's more space between the particles. So they're just interpreting what they're seeing, and they could have gotten the 1 mark for substance Z. But I can definitely see how you get to middle order. Definitely, if you feel like this is more of an application. For me, it was just that the answer felt more like a definition of kinetic energy and just having to identify which one it applies to, which is also something that they learned, that liquids have more kinetic energy because they have bigger spaces between their particles, etc. So that's why I felt lower order. Right, we have about 2 more questions to go. Question 2.3 involves calculations. It says substance X has a mass of 40 grams and the following measurements, length, breadth, and height, or 2 centimeters. And then it asks 2 calculation questions. calculate the volume of substance X and show calculations and calculate the density of substance X. And Adriette is going to post a poll for both of them collectively, because as you can think, they then have the same cognitive classification. So you can decide for this whole question here, they obviously lie on the same level. So is this low, middle, or high order for question 231 and 233? Okay, and with 17 responses in, we are leaning strongly towards middle order. We have a few higher orders coming in, and if we look at the chat, we're going middle, high, middle, high. So it seems to again be between those two. 32 responses coming in, middle order, and it's still in the lead with 89% in the chat. Again, middle order seems to be the order of the day. Right, so I'm going to call it. With 43 responses and a lot in the chat, the tribe has spoken, and I agree with the tribe in this essence. It is a middle order question. Remember, I stated calculations always occur in an unfamiliar context. Learners are expected to know the formula for volume. They're expected to know the formula for density, but they are given data in an unfamiliar context where they need to apply that formula. So this is a middle order for both of them. Now, something I thought of, and you can comment in the chat and I'll have a look at it later. If you didn't ask question 231, if you just asked question 232, so you gave them the whole intro of the length, breadth, and height, and then you asked them to calculate the density of the substance, would it then be a higher order question? Because learners now need to actually do a step on the side that no one instructs them about. So is it then evaluating what you've received in order to determine what you need to do and to get to the answer? I was actually wondering about that. In my mind, it feels like that might make it higher order because there's a hidden agenda somewhere. They first have to do the volume, even though they're not explicitly told it. But yeah, maybe make a few comments in the chat for me about that, and I'll have a look at it a bit later. Okay. Right, and then the last one that we're going to do is the last one, 2.5. It says, explain how you will determine whether substance X and substance Y are made of the same material or not. Okay, and here is the memo. For 5 marks, you're going to weigh each substance or / actually just determine its mass. You're going to calculate the volume of each one. Then you're going to calculate the density. Then you're going to compare the densities. If they are the same, they're made of the same material. If they are different, they're made of different materials. And on the memo, you can see 2 compulsory marks, and I'll explain what those are when we get to discussing the actual answer to the cognitive level. But basically, these are marks that learners need to have in their answer in order to get those 2 marks. So they could have written everything else and gotten 3 out of 5. But if they didn't have those last 2 sentences or the concepts within them, they couldn't have gotten those 2 marks. And I'm going to explain a bit more when we do that. So Adriette, you can post the poll for our final interactive example. Is this low, middle, or high? So I'm seeing a comment here about the difficulty of the question also factors in, and I definitely agree, except that it is not a cognitive assessment for the senior phase. It is included for the FET, and I particularly love difficulty levels more than I do blues, because I feel like it takes the memo into consideration, it takes the question structure into consideration, it takes the processing that the learner needs to go through mentally. So difficulty levels for me make a lot more sense, and I feel it's a more fair assessment of the question, but it's not one that we need to apply, as I understand it, for senior phase. Anyway, so if we're looking at the votes, oh, very strong for higher order. And if we look at the chat here, higher, 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 higher is the order of the day. So considering our time, I'm going to call it. This is assuredly a higher order question. Well done. for those of you who have guessed it. So the reasoning here is learners have to remember that density is used to determine if substances are of the same material. They have to then apply that knowledge to this example and actually create a method that they then describe in their words for the steps to this procedure. And it requires taking what they've learned, putting it into that method or procedure. And you can see that the memo with the 2 compulsory marks are also there, which actually also lends a higher degree of, as you would say, difficulty. And technically, compulsory marks are not something you frequently see within senior phase. It's something we use in FET, but I think we can implement it in senior phase, especially for our higher order questions. Because if you think about it this way, if a learner had written everything in the memo except those last 2 sentences, would they have answered the question at all? No, they wouldn't. If they hadn't answered, we compare densities, if they're the same, if they're different, what happens, then they haven't actually explained how to determine that the 2 substances are different. So that's why compulsory marks work in this instance. And it's something we could try to incorporate. You don't necessarily have to use them in all exams or use 2 of them. I think it might be very difficult, but remember, you have 15% to play with, and you have to use that 15% and recognize the fact that not all learners are going to get it, and that's okay. So there we see the whole question, and you can see again the progression in difficulty from low order, middle order to high order. And if you were wondering and worrying about this, these questions are all part of another resource that you will be receiving. We created a test resource bank for the grade 8 curriculum of examples of multiple choice questions and section B questions and different levels of that. And you've noticed with the multiple choice now that you can actually have different levels of multiple choice questions as well. And I really want to encourage you to actually do that in your exams. Don't just do straightforward one answer multiple choice. Use that to your advantage as well. Now, all of these questions that we've worked through are part of our new grade 8 natural sciences class text and study guide, because we wanted to show you that we really try to address the different cognitive levels and try to expose our learners and teachers to exam type questions in this publication. And it's a beautiful full color publication, the first one in the sciences edition or range. So Greta will give you some information about this publication towards the end, but I just wanted to page through and show you how lovely it looks. So I want to end off just by quickly talking about how to approach a question that has sub-skills in the memo, because we had a discussion about this on one of the 2 WhatsApp groups. So for example, a graph, right? Here we have a question. It gives learners data, and I'm just going to focus on the one that says, draw a bar graph to illustrate the number of prisoners suffering from each disease in prison 5, okay? Because graphs, if you look at their memos, are marked in sub-skills. It's not 6 marks for the entire drawing. There are marks awarded to certain things, like the type of graph, the caption, the labels. And we can't put all of that on one cognitive level. We have to look at them individually. So this is what it's typical, and you might disagree with me, but I'll give you the rationale behind it. And it's also based on the FET, right? So the type of graph is normally a low order question because it's said in the question, draw a bar graph. So learners just need to remember what a bar graph looks like, okay? Type of graph, low order. The caption of the graph is something that requires analysis and application because it's not given in the question. Learners either need to look at what's in the table, what's been said at the top there, or sometimes they're not even given enough information. They have to kind of think of their own heading. So that's definitely something that requires application of knowledge. Then the axis labels are also low order because typically they're in the table. Learners just need to know where to put which one, but labeling them and their units is typically something that's provided. The scale, which we provide 1 mark for, is again a middle order question because learners don't necessarily know what type of data they'll get. So the scale and actually plotting the scale is going to be a novel situation every time. And then lastly, plotting the marks is, if you think about how I explained understanding, which is translating of information, that is very much a low order mark because learners have to look at the graph. It says, at the table, it says 2, and now I know how to plot a 2 on the graph. So it's just translating the information into a different form. So important slide, I think, for those of you who might not be aware of this. And then obviously how you input this into your cognitive analysis grid also is something that might be new to you. So you have 6 marks for the graph, but you can't put all 6 marks under one. You have to actually divide them according to the different sub-skills. So 4 of the 6 marks are usually awarded for low order, 2 of the 6 marks for middle order. And then you could either have under topics a specific one for scientific skills, or maybe connect it with whatever topic you are assessing.